In the year 1258, one of the world's most magnificent cities, a metropolis of soaring minarets, sprawling palaces, and breathtaking intellect, was almost completely erased from the map. Its ruler, the Caliph of the entire Islamic world, wasn't just killed. He was handed an execution so bizarre and horrifying it became a legend. He was rolled up tightly in a heavy carpet and trampled to a pulp by the thundering hooves of Mongol warhorses. Why? Why such a strange and brutal end for one of the world's most powerful men? And how did his city, the center of a golden age, fall so far, so fast? To understand the story of the man in the carpet, we have to understand the city he lost and the unstoppable storm that came to claim it. This is the story of the Fall of Baghdad and the tragic, fatal miscalculations of its last caliph. To talk about Baghdad in the 13th century is to talk about a legend. This wasn't just a capital. For 500 years, it was the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate and the shining center of the Islamic Golden Age. While much of Europe was navigating a very different historical period, Baghdad was a beacon of civilization. Its official name, Madinat al-Salam, meant the city of peace, and for centuries, it had lived up to that title. Imagine a perfectly circular city, a wonder of urban planning, with the caliph's palace and the grand mosque at its heart. Spreading out from the center were markets overflowing with silks from China, spices from India, and furs from the north. Its streets were paved and lit at night, serviced by a complex web of canals. Hospitals gave free care to the sick, and observatories mapped the stars with stunning accuracy. But the real treasure of Baghdad was its intellectual life, centered on the legendary House of Wisdom, the Bait al-Hikmah. Founded centuries earlier, it was more than a library. It was one of the world's great academic institutions. Scholars of every faith and from every corner of the known world gathered here. They translated the works of the ancient Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, into Arabic, saving them for the future. But they didn't just preserve knowledge, they built on it. The very foundations of algebra were laid here by thinkers like Al-Khwarizmi. Its library was immense, considered one of the largest in the world, holding texts on medicine, math, and philosophy. Knowledge was so valued that books were sometimes seen as greater spoils of war than gold. For 500 years, Baghdad wasn't just a city of power, but a city of ideas. It was an intellectual capital of the planet, a treasure chest of human achievement, and it was all about to burn. Presiding over this glittering yet fragile jewel was the 37th Abbasid Caliph, Al-Musta'sim Billah. He came to the throne in 1242, inheriting a legacy that was much grander than the man himself. By the mid-13th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was a ghost of its former self. Once a massive empire, its political power had faded, with local warlords controlling most of the land. The Caliph in Baghdad was still the spiritual head of Sunni Islam, a hugely important symbolic figure, but his direct control barely reached beyond the walls of his own city. Al-Musta'sim was, by most accounts, not the man for a crisis. He's described as an indecisive and ineffective ruler, easily swayed by his advisors, who were busy with their own bitter rivalries. His court was a mess of intrigue, especially between a Sunni faction led by his son and a Shia faction led by his chief minister. This internal division paralyzed the government. Instead of strengthening the caliphate, Al-Musta'sim seemed more interested in the leisurely pace of palace life. He was reportedly cheap, refusing to spend his dynasty's vast treasures on the city's defenses or his own soldiers, a decision that would seal his city's fate. He had a deep and totally misplaced confidence in his own status. He seemed to think the title of caliph acted as a kind of divine shield, Who would dare strike at the heart of Islam? He once arrogantly dismissed the female ruler of Egypt, offering to send them a man to rule if they couldn't find one. This was the pride of a man coasting on his ancestors' glory, dangerously oblivious to the fact that his world was about to be annihilated. He saw himself as the sacred center of the universe, but in reality, he was just a man sitting on a pile of treasure, directly in the path of the most destructive force the world had ever seen. That force had a name: the Mongols. Forged into a terrifying weapon by Genghis Khan decades earlier, the Mongol Empire was like nothing the world had seen. Their armies, made up entirely of cavalry, moved with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. They were masters of siege warfare, absorbing engineers and technology from every land they conquered. But their deadliest weapon was terror. Their policy was brutally simple: submit without question or be completely destroyed. It was a lesson they'd taught to kingdoms from China to Russia. In 1251, a new great Khan, Mongol, grandson of Genghis, took power. He gave his brother, Hulagu Khan, a single, monumental task: march west and bring Persia, Syria, and Mesopotamia under Mongol control. This meant destroying the Order of the Assassins in their mountain strongholds, and most importantly, demanding the submission of the Caliph in Baghdad. Hulagu was the perfect man for the job: brilliant, ruthless, and unstoppable. He marched with a colossal army, perhaps the largest Mongol force ever assembled, with some estimates putting it between 100,000 and 150,000 men. It wasn't just Mongol horsemen. It included skilled Chinese siege engineers and troops from conquered Christian kingdoms like Georgia and Armenia. The Mongol worldview just couldn't coexist with the caliphs. In their shamanistic beliefs, there was one god in the sky, Tengri, and so there could only be one ruler on earth, the Great Khan. Anyone else was either a subject or an enemy. They didn't see a holy man in Baghdad. They saw a local chief who refused to bow. The cultural gap was too wide to bridge. As Hulagu's army spent years grinding its way west, first wiping out the assassins with terrifying efficiency, a storm was gathering, and it was heading straight for Baghdad. In the autumn of 1257, the storm finally hit Baghdad's gates, not with soldiers, but with messengers. Hulagu Khan sent an ultimatum to Caliph Al-Musta'sim. The letter was classic Mongol diplomacy, a mix of veiled threats and open demands. Hulagu reminded the Caliph that he'd failed to send troops to help the Mongols against the assassins, something expected of a subordinate. Hulagu's message was blunt: destroy your ramparts, fill in your moats, and come to us. If you do not heed our advice, get ready for the field of battle. When I lead my troops in wrath against Baghdad, even if you hide in the sky or in the earth, I shall bring you down. I shall put your city and country to the torch. Inside the palace, there was panic and indecision. The Caliph's vizier urged his master to appease the Mongols, to send lavish gifts and offer words of submission to buy time. But others, including the Caliph's own son, pushed for defiance. They foolishly thought the entire Muslim world would rush to defend the Caliphate. Al-Musta'sim chose the worst possible path: empty arrogance. His reply to Hulagu was full of bluster, warning the Khan of the wrath of Allah and the mighty armies of Islam that would rise against him. He wrote as if he commanded legions, when his own forces were small and neglected. Hulagu's response was pure fury. The time for talking was over. Even as the Mongol horde converged on Baghdad from 3 directions, the Caliph made no serious preparations. He didn't strengthen the walls, he didn't gather supplies for a long siege, and he didn't rally his army, a pathetic force of maybe 50,000 men, which was no match for the Mongol war machine. To make things worse, recent floods had already weakened the city's eastern defenses. Al-Musta'sim was trapped by his own pride. a king in a crumbling castle, hearing the thunder of approaching hooves and still thinking it was just a passing shower. On January 29th, 1258, the Siege of Baghdad began. The Mongol army, a sea of warriors and siege engines, surrounded the city of peace. Hulagu set up his command on a nearby hill as his Chinese engineers got to work, building barriers and digging trenches. Giant catapults began pounding the city walls, day and night. The Caliph's army tried one desperate attack. It was a disaster. They were lured into a trap where Mongol forces upstream broke river dikes, flooding the land behind the Abbasid troops and cutting off their retreat. Caught between the Mongols and the rising water, they were almost completely wiped out. The city's main defenders were gone. Inside Baghdad, hope curdled into terror. The constant bombardment breached the eastern wall in just days. By February 5th, Mongol soldiers were pouring over the battlements. Realizing all was lost, the Caliph frantically tried to negotiate, sending out messengers to surrender. But Hulagu, who had demanded total submission and gotten only threats, refused. There would be no terms. On February 10th, Caliph Al-Musta'sim, his sons, and about 3,000 officials walked out of the city gates and surrendered unconditionally. For 3 days, the Mongol army waited. Then, on February 13th, they were unleashed. What followed was one of the most catastrophic sacks of a city in history. For a full week, the Mongols rampaged. Palaces, mosques, hospitals, and homes were looted and burned to the ground. The population was massacred. Men, women, and children were cut down in the streets. The exact death toll is impossible to know. Historical accounts give figures from 200,000 to over 1 million, but modern historians believe the number was likely in the hundreds of thousands, a still horrifying figure. It's said that the city's Christian community was spared, reportedly due to the influence of Hulagu's Christian wife, but this isn't universally confirmed. And the books, the Soul of Baghdad, were destroyed. The great libraries, including the irreplaceable House of Wisdom, were ransacked. Countless manuscripts, the collected knowledge of centuries, were either burned or thrown into the Tigris River. Eyewitnesses claimed the water ran black with the ink of dissolving books, a river of lost knowledge. A civilization was being unwritten. While his city burned, Caliph Al-Musta'sim was a prisoner, forced to watch the end of his world. Hulagu made the Caliph show him where he kept his secret treasury, a legendary hoard of gold and jewels gathered over 500 years. Once the treasure was seized, Hulagu reportedly held a grim banquet. He had platters of gold brought to the Caliph and sarcastically told him to eat. When Al-Musta'sim said, "You can't eat gold," Hulagu shot back, "Then why did you keep it and not give it to your soldiers?" It was a brutal lesson in the uselessness of wealth without the means to defend it. The final act came on February 20th, 1258. For Hulagu, the execution was tricky. According to Mongol spiritual beliefs, it was taboo to spill royal blood on the sacred earth. It could offend their gods and bring disaster. But the Caliph could not be allowed to live. So, they found a solution that was both ritually correct and deeply humiliating. The most widely reported account says that Al-Musta'sim was laid down and rolled up tightly in a heavy carpet, a symbol of the very luxury his court was known for. Other sources suggest he was put in a sack or even starved to death. But in the most famous version of the story, with the Caliph and his family bundled and helpless, the Mongol warhorses were ridden back and forth over them, trampling and kicking until the men inside were crushed to death, their blood contained within the rug, never touching the ground. It was a death designed to extinguish not just a man, but the idea of his sacredness, leaving him broken and suffocated in the dark. The death of Al-Musta'sim was more than the end of a single man. It was the end of an era. The 500-year-old Abbasid Caliphate, the institution that had unified Islam for centuries, was gone forever. Although a shadow caliphate was later set up in Cairo, the office's universal power was shattered. The sack of Baghdad is widely seen as the definitive end of the Islamic Golden Age. The intellectual and cultural center of the Middle East was destroyed, a blow from which it would take centuries to recover. Power in the region shifted away from Arab dynasties and towards Turkic and Mongol rulers. The fall of Baghdad sent a shockwave of trauma across the Muslim world. It became a dark legend, a story of a civilization lost, and a horrifying testament to what happens when pride, complacency, and division meet a force of absolute, unrelenting will. The story of the Caliph trampled in a carpet is a cautionary tale about a king who so profoundly underestimated the world outside his palace walls that he ended up crushed beneath its weight. The echoes of 1258 are a long, haunting reminder that no golden age is guaranteed to last forever. The foundations of even the greatest cities can be washed away by the tides of history. Sometimes, all that's left is a tragic story and the ghost of a river running black with ink.